two seminars we tried to define critical thinking. We saw how hard it was to define it properly. We also tried to understand what it means to be critical and why it is important for ourselves and for our society. We then reflected on how to become critical and assessed a number of different strategies for teaching critical thinking in the classroom. We finished the second seminar by reflecting on whether critical thinking skills and abilities and methodologies are universal or culture-specific and therefore context-dependent. Today, we will do something a little bit different. We will try to explore the relations between critical thinking and creative thinking. And I think there are many profitable relations there that can be assessed. Like the previous time, before we get into the main business of this talk, I think it might be worth just summarizing very briefly the content of this talk. So here they are. I will start by essentially giving a brief definition of critical and creative thinking, not spending much time on critical thinking because we already spent a lot of time on this last time, and analyzing how critical and creative thinking diverge, so in which respect they diverge. Having done that, we will look at, I will provide some pedagogical perspective on critical and creative thinking, and then offer, very briefly, a review of the cognitive dimensions underlying this form of thinking. Having done that, we will briefly reflect on the dispositions or attributes that are typical of critical and creative thinkers, and now we will go on, and then we will go on to analyze how to articulate critical and creative thinking within these different disciplines. So essentially, we will look at how critical and creative thinking, the understanding of critical and creative thinking, can change, can vary across different disciplines in the humanities, for instance, and the sciences. And that will be the first part of the talk. Second part of the talk will be all about saying, reviewing a number of strategies for developing creative thought in the classroom. And since last time there was here someone who was teaching to kids, or high school students, I've included, I think, a couple of strategies for high school teachers as well, which might be helpful. So basically, as you see, this second part of the talk, section number 6, echoes what we've done in the last part of the second seminar, which was providing a number of strategies for teaching critical thinking to students. Okay, so these are the contents of this talk. A little bit about the relations. Let's start with by saying a little bit about the relations between critical and creative thinking. Now, the relation between critical and creative thinking is one that is very difficult to spell out, well, mostly because of the lack of a universally agreed definitions for both critical and creative thinking. We saw that for critical thinking already, no need to repeat this. What I'm going to say now next is why is providing a definition of creative thinking so difficult. But first and foremost, because critical thinking is conceptualized often differently across different disciplines. So it is often referred, for instance, as innovation in education, entrepreneurship in business, or problem solving in disciplines such as mathematics, law, or engineering. Further complication lies in the diverse way in which the relationship between critical and creative thinking are also conceptualized. For instance, and I mentioned this in the previous talk, there are some educators that view them as divergent skills. Some others, as Paul and Elder, argue that they are part of the same skills, more specifically that creative thinking is just one of the many dimensions of critical thinking. Others view them, such as Fisher, view them instead as complementary skills that both encourage independent and student-centered learning. Now, I don't take any strong position on this. I'm just reviewing, I'm just mentioning the different possibilities out there. My hunch is that I'll be mostly sympathetic with Paul and Elder perspective, who think that critical and creative thinking are somehow related, and the latter, creative, is part of the former, critical. But, the scholars have different opinions on this. Now, the main point is that there is really no commonly shared understanding of these terms, and all we can do is to try to identify the dimension of these constructs. So we could say that, for instance, whereas creative thinking is a form of thinking that is divergent, critical thinking is convergent. Whereas creative thinking tries to create something new, critical thinking seeks to assess the worth or validity of something that already exists. Whereas creative thinking is carried out by violating accepted principles, critical thinking is typically pursued by applying accepted principles. And here is a nice table which is taken and adapted from Fisher 2002, which is supposed to expand on the major differences between critical thinking and creative thinking. So we could say that critical thinking is normally understood as a form of analytical thinking, which is convergent, vertical, leading to probability of judgment, all about hypothesis testing, supposedly objective, closed, linear, logical, and based on reasoning. Whereas creative thinking instead could be defined as a form of thinking which is highly generative, divergent, lateral, leading to possibility and suspended judgment, all about hypothesis forming and therefore highly subjective, open-ended, associative, intuitive in character, and highly speculative. So these are, say, the major differences between critical and creative thinking. Next, despite, we saw that it's very difficult to come up with a strict definition of both these terms and concepts, I would like to spend a little bit of time to summarize, to try to define them in general. Okay, as we have seen in the previous seminar, so starting with critical thinking. So as we have seen in the previous seminar, critical thinking can be defined as a sort of self-regulatory judgment, which is a human cognitive process involving at least the use of a core set of cognitive skills, which are interpretation, analysis, evaluation, explanation, and self-regulation. We already saw that the critical thinker is typically habitually inquisitive, well-informed, trusted reason, open-minded, flexible, is a long list, fair-minded in evaluation, honest in facing personal biases, prudent in making judgments, willing to reconsider, clear about issues, orderly in complex manner, diligent in seeking relevant information, as well as reasonable in the selection of criteria, focus on inquiry, and persistent in seeking results, which are as precise as the subject and the circumstances of inquiry permit. This is a long quote from Shorman, that guy. Okay, so to summarize very briefly, critical thinking, we can say that it's all about applying well-known criteria to a problem, so turning the handle and producing some answers. So critical thinking happens when we look for faults in a position, or better, when by integrating different perspectives, we try to come up with a reasonable, more balanced understanding of the points of the issue at stake. What about creative thinking? Now, creative thinking, by contrast, could be defined as an ability to generate new, varied, and unique ideas, and as involving a number of skills such as flexibility, originality, fluency, elaboration, brainstorming, modification, imagery, associative thinking, metaphorical thinking, with the overall aim of stimulating curiosity and promoting divergence. Now, before we get on with talking about creativity, I think there is some kind of methodological precisation that we need to do, and it is about how to understand the term creativity and creative thinking. Now, in the literature, these two terms are often understood as essentially as the same thing, and used interchangeably. And often, in my talk, I probably do the same. There is one reason to do this, because surely these two terms are interconnected, in the sense that creative thinking is a process that contributes to fostering creativity, but we should understand that they are theoretically two distinct things. More specifically, creative thinking can be viewed as part of a broader interaction of elements, as this scholar has argued, Teresa Amabile, in her book. Creative thinking, or what she calls creativity-relevant skills, can be viewed as part of the process that contributes to creativity, alongside many others. So, in her account, creative thinking is used to refer to the more cognitive and definable aspects of the creative process, so essentially skills. Here are some definitions of creativity. Again, I'm listing them, I'm not siding with any of them, I'm just putting them there because I think each of these definitions point to something, so that it might be useful to keep in mind if we want to try to understand what is creativity. The first definition says creativity requires a balance among synthetic, analytic, and practical abilities. According to Cropley, creativity involves departing from the facts, finding new ways, making unusual association, or seeing unexpected solutions. And you see that Torrance is pretty much in line on the same page. He says creativity is the process of sensing difficulties, problems, gaps in information, missing elements, making guesses and formulating hypotheses about these deficiencies, evaluating and testing these guesses and hypotheses, possibly revising and retesting them, and finally communicating these results. So, before I said something that in some disciplines there is creativity is understood as innovation. But this is something that, again, might be worth saying. Well, in education, for instance, in business, creativity is understood as innovation. But if we look at the relationship between these two terms, perhaps it's worth saying that there is a theoretical divide between them. And more specifically, creativity is sort of is the precondition for innovation. So, while creativity is typically used to refer to the act of producing new ideas, approaches, or action, innovation is normally defined as the process of generating and applying such criteria, such creative ideas, within a specific context. So yeah, you can say that creativity has some sort of ontological priority, if you want to be a philosopher, over innovation. Okay, so all this to say that essentially creative thinking happens when you come up with something new, something that no one else has thought about before. So creativity is all about finding a new application of existing knowledge and understanding, or better, about linking in a new way, not just to summarize them, as in creative thinking, ideas together to form a new paradigm, something new. So creativity essentially involves being inventive, expressive, and showing information and showing imagination. Okay, so having briefly looked at the yes.
May I ask just one short question? What is the principal difference between creativity and creative thinking?
Yes, well, I'll say that creative thinking is all about assessing data and things, whereas creativity is producing something new. So one is about using reason to assess data, hypothesis, or something. Whereas the other, creativity, is something that it uses reason, it uses some principles that are typical to creative thinking, such as integrating ideas and hypotheses, but to create something new. So that I would say is not the major difference. Where one is used to assessing things, the other is used to create new things, new ideas.
What we're talking about is extensions of these two concepts. May I ask as follows? Suppose you meet some artist, very creative man, who can be very innovative in his creative process. Does he possess, in any sense, creative thinking?
Critical, you mean?
Creative thinking.
Yes, of course. I think
so creative thinking is necessary for any artist to make something new.
Well, I mean, I'm not an art expert, but I would expect, yes, to have some, unless it depends what kind of art you do. If there are some kind of art that replicates previous things, like neoclassicism is kind of replicating classicism. So in that respect, I guess there's not much in the stylistic sense new, creative going on. Although, you might argue that within neoclassicism there are certain authors or artists that come up with new techniques that significantly differs from those deployed by standard classicists. So in that sense, even if they're kind of replicating previous artistic works, they are still kind of innovating or creating something new within that same paradigm. So I would say maybe, yeah, for any artist, maybe creative thinking is, it's necessary.
But usually they don't think.
What do you mean?
They just use their imagination, not thinking.
Well, it depends. I mean, using your imagination maybe is part of thinking. Maybe they think unconsciously. It could be argued that even when Pollock does this crazy stuff, right? First of all, it's one type of art, which you cannot generalize. Contemporary art, even if it's crazy, and it might appear that they're not thinking, but maybe there are some underlying patterns that are recurrent in those artists' minds, so that they replicate these patterns unconsciously, and maybe that could be argued. It's form of original thinking, creative thinking. I'm thinking, all the different, for instance, expressionism, Klimt, and all those artists, Kokoschka, sorry, I didn't get the song. So Kokoschka and all of those. So you see that the same pattern, right? Some same crazy style, but within each author, within each painting, you find something new. So everyone is pushing the boundaries in their own field. So maybe, I would expect that creativity is necessary to any artist. Creative thinking is necessary to any artist in order to pursue their work. Whether or not this is something that is explicitly acknowledged or understood by the artist himself, or by those people that appreciate the artistic production, that's another question. I leave it up to you to decide. But I would think that you need some sort of creative thinking to produce a form of art, even if you are replicating some form of art, which is the worst case against this argument. Because obviously, if you are making something new, then you're creating, right? So, I don't know, I'm not sure. This is just my idea. I could be wrong.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so that's the first part. So having defined and analyzed the relations between critical and creative thinking, I would like to offer to review and to offer a number of pedagogical perspectives on critical and creative thinking. Now, obviously, pedagogical perspectives on critical thinking have changed over the last 2 decades, as it happens in many fields. But while there is a consensus that the main purpose of higher education is to teach students how to think critically, and remember, we saw that in the previous seminar when we analyzed that study from that survey from UCLA about teachers explicitly acknowledging the need for students to learn critical thinking. Well, there are still a number of theoretical issues which remain unresolved in the field. One such issue is probably the most important, is whether critical thinking is a universal, generic skill, or whether instead it's inseparable from the disciplines in which it's being taught. Again, here I'm not assuming taking any strict position in the field. I'm just reviewing what eminent scholars have said about this. Robert Ennis, which you may know from previous time, is the big guy. We analyzed one of his definitions about critical thinking. But for Ennis, he believes that critical skills might be applied to different situations. So he maintains that they exist as a set of independent cognitive abilities which can be taught in relation to any disciplinary context. Another guy, eminent guy as well, McPeck, in this book, 1981, I think, he argues that critical thinking is the appropriate use of reflective skepticism with the problem area under consideration. So in his view, critical thinking, the practice of critical thinking cannot be separated from the disciplines to which it is applied. So you see there are two very different perspectives on this idea. There are also third way positions, like this one defended by Moon, who proposes that essentially the purpose of critical thinking is to enable learners to shift from an absolute conception of knowledge towards contextual knowing, shift from superficial or descriptive responses to critical issues, understand the context in which critical thinking is required, display flexibility in thinking, display metacognition, use creativity in an appropriate manner, and discuss issues of objectivity and subjectivity with respect to thinking processes. So you can see this position is kind of bridging the gap within the previous two we discussed earlier. What about creativity? Again, things are a bit complicated. Creativity usually has been understood as being viewed as individual genius, something that could not be taught. More recently, however, an increasingly number of scholars have started to conceptualize creativity as something that can be learned and recognized in all students. So creativity has become increasingly placed and located within the processes and product of collaborative and purposeful activity. As a consequence, the emerging focus on creativity in education is now on, well, as you can see from this book here from Andy Kraft, 2003, ordinary creativity rather than genius creativity, on characterizing creativity empirically rather than measure it with some abstract rules or methods. And most importantly, it's all about looking at the social system that drives it. So how the context shaped creativity, and not only studying the individual in isolation from the world, which is something that is going on more generally in philosophy of mind as well, where, for instance, this is connected with my field, where a lot of people have started to investigate the relationship between human and environment, and how the environment can shape our cognitive abilities. But anyway, this is not related to this, it's just a minor point, if you're interested in philosophy. Okay, so creativity is also now economically valued and often said to be team-based. What does this mean? Well, it means that the focus for educators on creativity should be on the attributes of the individual and their work relative to the environmental context. In other words, creativity ought to be understood as an attitude, as a way of thinking, as a skill in a workplace, no longer as something that is genetically inherited, an attribute or an ability typical of the individual. Okay, these are some perspective on pedagogical perspective on critical and creative thinking. Next, let's look at some of the cognitive dimensions underlying critical and creative thinking. So, philosophy of critical thinking has increasingly focused on promoting an understanding of critical thinking that encompasses various cognitive and affective processes and abilities, and this is largely the result of this of Ruggerio's holistic model, which was proposed in this book here, Becoming a Critical Thinker in 1998, where there was a connection made between disposition skills and processes in understanding critical thinking. On the path sort of opened by this book, and also a number of authors have recognized and emphasized the cognitive ability of self-regulation as an essential part of critical thinking. Authors, for instance, such as Van der Waal, have argued that when trying to teach critical thinking to students in the classroom, one has to distinguish between two different types of critical thinking. And these are what he calls situational critical thinking, that is needed in decision making and for practical purposes, usually deployed in certain scientific disciplines mostly, and what he calls epistemological, theoretical critical thinking, that is used in disciplines where critical thinking is primarily applied to arguments and positions. What about creativity? Well, again, we have a big landscape here. Something we can say is that some authors have have kind of analyzed these dimensions of creativity. So for them, creativity involves creating new developments and challenging establishing idea, developing new approaches that are appropriate to a particular problem, achieving some purpose, whether it is to solve a problem or to make a profit, identifying new solutions to problems and risking failure. These two guys in this book, 2006, have expanded on that view and have identified the following meanings of creativity via surveys with academic staff in different disciplines. So, according to these authors, one could say that the cognitive dimensions of creativity involve originality, imagination, storytelling and resourcefulness, willingness to explore, making sense of complexity, thinking outside of the disciplinary box, synthesizing and communicating, and so on, among others. Okay, another thing that we could say about creativity, and to say a bit more about the cognitive dimension of creativity, is to review Sternberg's propulsion theory of creative contributions, which essentially proposes that creativity can be of three different kinds. And these are types of creativity that accept current paradigms and attempt to extend them via replication, redefinition, forward implementation. Types of creativity that reject current paradigms and attempts to replace them via redirection, reconstruction, or reinitiation. And types of creativity that synthesize current paradigms. Okay, finally, to put a hat on this, we can say something very briefly about what this guy, a famous psychologist, American-Hungarian psychologist, thinks about creativity. I'm not sure about I pronounced the name correctly. I think Csikszentmihalyi should be, but if there is someone who knows Hungarian, I gladly accept corrections. So he says that creativity is the result of the interactions between three subsystems. a domain, a person, and a field. And it occurs essentially when people try to integrate different things and perform something new. So again, for you, creativity is mostly about creating something new, something that wasn't there before, which is in line with what we said before. Okay, so having looked at pedagogical perspective of critical and creative thinking and review a number of cognitive dimensions of these constructs, we can look at what are the critical and creative, what are the dispositions underlying critical and creative thinking. And this I'm going to do next. Let's start with critical thinking. Some authors view the disposition to use critical thinking skills as vital to the meaning of critical thinking. For example, Alpern, you remember we came across this name last time when we reviewed some of those methods for assessing critical thinking skills in the classroom. Well, he is the proponent of one of those methods. He argues that critical thinking, that an essential part of critical thinking is developing the attitude or disposition of critical thinker, something that, to which I fundamentally agree. But the majority of educators, however, agree that the skills and processes of critical thinking are distinguishable from the disposition to use them. This guy, Gione, notes, being skilled does not guarantee that a student is disposed towards use critical thinking, and having a disposition towards critical thinking does not ensure that a student has well developed critical thinking skills. What about creativity? According to Stenberg, he says there are different types of creativity, and well, no different. Well, yeah, we already said that there are different types of creativity, but creativity involves the confluence of 6 distinct and interrelated resources, which are intellectual skills, knowledge, thinking styles, personality, motivation, and environment. Note that some of these are common to critical thinking. So again, this raises the question of how do you distinguish between critical thinking and creativity? What do they have in common? How do they diverge? But anyway, for him, having creative skills is not sufficient to creativity. In order to be creative, a student must first make the decision to use the skill to think creatively. That is, she actually, must make a decision to generate new ideas, analyze, and sell them to others. He also notes that if students are reluctant to do such decision, to perform such acts, is because often creativity is not encouraged in the educational world. And he says that it is important for teachers to promote an environment that is conducive of creative thinking. We will review how to do this later on in the final part of this talk. But next, let me say something about how we can articulate critical and creative thinking across different disciplines, and why critical and creative thinking differs so much across different disciplines. So much that, for example, you can say that critical thinking in history is about examining evidence and content, discussing complexity and ambiguities, whereas in physics it's mostly about examining assumption. The same goes on for creativity. Humanities disciplines tend to value the student's ability to discover and articulate new meanings and their openness to new ideas and experiences. By contrast, business-related disciplines, when talking about creativity, means business, so they essentially mean entrepreneurship, and for them creativity involves making the most out of opportunities and acting upon them in the face of risk. That said, we can probably agree with Stenberg when he notes that there is no correct program to teach critical thinking and creative thinking skills. It largely depends on the program goals and content, the context of culture in which the learner thinking is to be situated. For instance, the last time we talked about logic, I didn't mention logic because I'm not a logician, but surely logic would be something that students should be learning. But the question would be whether logic would be part of the course of critical thinking, or students should be exposed to a full course of logic, which would then complement critical thinking, a course of critical thinking, which would probably be better. But it depends again on how much time do you have on your course, what kind of things you want to talk in your course, at which level you want to teach them logic, and so on. So largely, as he says, it's mostly there's no real, there's no only one way to teach critical and creative thinking to students. It depends on the context and what you can do.